It's somewhere deep in the Ice Age. You're standing outside, completely naked, and it is cold in a way that modern humans genuinely cannot imagine. Not forgot my jacket cold. Not where are my gloves cold. We're talking wind cutting through you like the world itself is trying to kill you, because it is. You have a dead animal at your feet. It's big, it's heavy, and its skin is still warm. So you do what any reasonable, desperate, freezing primate would do. You pull it over your shoulders. That's it. That's the origin story of fashion. Except it isn't. Not even close. Because there's a second step nobody talks about. The step that turns a raw, rotting hide into something you can actually wear. The step that takes weeks of disgusting, backbreaking, stomach-turning work. The step that involves things pulled straight from inside a skull, wrung out of organs, soaked in urine, and scraped until your hands bleed. The first piece of clothing humans ever made required them to do things so unpleasant that, by comparison, your morning commute is basically a spa day. And here's the strangest part. The way we know it happened at all? Lice. Stay with me. This is the good part. The parasite that dated our underwear. Let's start with the lice, because it genuinely is the most bizarre detective story in the history of fashion. Here's the thing about human lice. They're picky. Obsessively, infuriatingly picky. The lice that live in your head hair are a different species from the lice that live on your body. And body lice, the kind that nestle into clothing fibers, cannot survive without fabric. They need it. It's their entire world. Take the clothes away and they die. Which means body lice could not have existed before clothing existed. Scientists figured this out and realized something remarkable. If you trace body lice back to their evolutionary origin point, back to the moment they first split off from head lice, you find the approximate moment humans started regularly wearing clothes. The answer, depending on which genetic study you look at, puts the origin of habitual clothing somewhere between roughly 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. The range is wide. The science is tricky. But the direction is clear. We were wearing clothes long before we left Africa. Long before we needed to survive ice ages in Europe and Asia. Which means clothing wasn't invented as a desperate response to cold. It was already part of our toolkit when we arrived at the cold. That reframes everything. Okay, this is where it gets weird. Because if early humans in Africa were wearing animal skins in relatively warm climates, they weren't just doing it to survive the temperature. They were doing it for other reasons. Status, maybe. Protection from thorns and insects. Or, and this is the uncomfortable possibility, they just liked how it looked. Vanity might be older than agriculture. But before anyone could feel good about what they were wearing, they had to make it wearable. And that's where things get truly, spectacularly unpleasant. Fresh skin is useless. Here's what nobody tells you when they talk about cavemen and animal furs. A fresh hide, a skin just pulled off an animal, is not clothing. It is not even close to clothing. It is a wet, heavy, foul-smelling sheet of organic material that will within days begin to rot. It will stiffen in the cold until it's rigid as wood. It will crack. It will tear. It will smell like something died in it because something did. And then maggots. Actually, forget the maggots. Let's not. The point is, raw skin is biologically hostile to being clothing. The problem is a layer inside the hide called the dermis, the deep connective tissue packed with proteins that, as they dry and then get wet again and then dry again, will destroy the hide from the inside. If you've ever left leather shoes out in the rain a few times, you've seen a very gentle version of this process. To make skin into leather, into something soft, durable, flexible, and wearable, you have to break down those proteins. Chemically. Completely. And the tools our ancestors had for doing this were whatever their environment provided. Which brings us to the first disgusting secret. Animal brains. Specifically, the brain of the animal whose skin you're trying to turn into clothing. Brain tanning is one of the oldest hide processing techniques known. And it works because brain tissue is rich in emulsifying fats that penetrate the hide and coat the collagen fibers, essentially lubricating them so they can slide against each other instead of fusing into a stiff, brittle sheet. The old craftsman's saying that every animal has just enough brains to tan its own hide is almost certainly apocryphal. But the method is real. You take the brain, you mash it, you mix it with water, You work it into the soaked hide, and then you spend hours pulling, stretching, and kneading the skin while it dries. It's called working the hide. The literal translation of that phrase is, you don't stop moving your hands until it's done or you pass out. Let that sit for a second. The urine solution, brain tanning, is just one method. And depending on where you were and what season it was, brains weren't always available or weren't enough. So here's where our ancestors made a creative choice that is either brilliantly practical or completely insane, genuinely hard to tell. Urine, specifically aged urine, fermented urine, urine that had been sitting in a vessel long enough to break down into something even more chemically aggressive, ammonia. The reason this works is almost poetic in a grim way. The ammonia in aged urine is a powerful alkali. When you soak a fresh hide in an ammonia solution, it swells the fibers, begins to loosen the outer layers, and makes the skin dramatically more receptive to whatever tanning agents come next. It also removes hair. If you wanted a smooth, hairless leather, for lighter clothing, for water containers, for pouches, you soaked the hide in a urine bath until the hair loosened and you could scrape it off clean. The archaeological evidence for this is frustratingly thin because liquid process doesn't preserve the way stone tools do. But across dozens of traditional cultures documented by anthropologists, cultures that maintained pre-industrial hide-working techniques into the modern era, urine was a near-universal step, from the Arctic to the American plains to sub-Saharan Africa. When dozens of completely separate cultures, with no contact with each other, all independently converge on the same disgusting solution that tells you something. It tells you the solution works, and that it was probably discovered early. Possibly very early. Here's the part nobody puts in the textbooks. The people doing this work, scraping hides, working brains into wet skin, managing urine baths, were most likely women. Not because they were assigned the gross jobs, but because hide working in ethnographic records is almost universally women's skilled labor. It was complex, technical, knowledge-intensive work. It took years to learn properly. A skilled hide worker was a significant community asset. The first tailors in human history weren't men with needles. They were women with bone scrapers and a very high tolerance for unpleasant smells. The needle that changed everything. Making leather is one thing. Shaping it into something that fits a human body is another. For a long time, a very, very long time, clothing was probably draped and tied. You couldn't cut hide into fitted shapes without a way to join them back together. A cloak draped over shoulders works. A cloak with armholes requires something else. It requires a needle. And the needle, when it appeared, was a genuinely radical technology. The oldest known sewing needles, made from bone, with actual eyes punched through them for thread, date back tens of thousands of years. They've been found across multiple sites in multiple continents. Wherever humans were pushing into seriously cold environments, needles appeared. Because draping and tying a hide will keep you alive in mild cold. In serious cold, the kind of cold where exposed skin kills you within minutes, you need fitted clothing. Clothing that traps a layer of warm air against your body. Clothing with sleeves. Clothing with hoods. Clothing where the gaps are minimized, not flapping in an Arctic wind. The peoples who colonized the coldest parts of the Ice Age Earth weren't just tough. They were technically sophisticated in a way that is easy to underestimate. Think about the knowledge chain required. You need to identify the right animal. Kill it. Process the hide through a multi-day chemical treatment using brains and possibly urine. Smoke the finished leather to make it water-resistant. Yes, smoking was also part of this. Cut it into precise shapes that, when joined together, conform to a human body. Thread sinew or plant fiber through a bone needle small enough that the whole doesn't tear. Then do it again and again, for everyone in your group, every season. This isn't primitive. This is an industry. A distributed, knowledge-intensive, labor-heavy industry that sustained human life in environments that would otherwise be completely uninhabitable. Every time we use the word primitive to describe these people, we are embarrassing ourselves. Why we still carry it. Here's what I think is the strangest part of this story. The process barely changed for most of human history. Brain tanning, urine soaking, scraping, smoking. The basic toolkit for turning a dead animal into clothing was essentially stable for tens of thousands of years. Industrial tanning, using chromium salts, using chemical processes at scale, That's a modern thing, a very modern thing. And even then, brain-tanned leather made by hand is still considered by traditional craftspeople to be among the softest, most durable leather in the world. It didn't need to be improved. It just needed to be scaled. There's something almost humbling about that. Our ancestors stood at the bottom of an enormous technical problem. How do we survive in an environment we are biologically unsuited for? And they solved it. Not quickly, not cleanly, not without significant exposure to things no one would voluntarily interact with, but completely. They looked at a dead animal, at a skull full of gray matter, at a vessel of fermented urine, and they saw clothing. They saw survival. They saw warmth. And then they sat down and worked until their hands bled. They didn't have gloves, by the way. The bone needle they developed to sew fitted Arctic clothing is considered by some researchers to be one of the most important inventions in human history. More important than the wheel, possibly. Because without fitted cold weather gear, modern humans don't colonize Europe or Asia, don't reach the Americas, don't spread across the planet. A bone needle the size of your pinky finger, threaded with animal sinew, might be the object that made global civilization possible. And the hand that held it almost certainly smelled like something you really don't want to think about. So the next time you pull on a jacket without thinking about it, that automatic, completely unconscious gesture of grabbing fabric and putting it on your body, remember what that gesture used to cost. Days of labor, organs pulled from a carcass, bowls of liquid no one should spend any time near, hands that never fully stopped smelling like the work. Our ancestors didn't just survive by being strong. They survived by being willing to do whatever it took, no matter how unpleasant, no matter how long, no matter how much it cost them. They cracked skulls open. They saved urine in containers. They knelt over wet hides in the cold and worked until the skin was soft enough to wear. And because they did, because a chain of nameless, resourceful, deeply committed people passed that knowledge forward across thousands of generations, you are warm right now. You've been warm your whole life. You've never had to think about it once. 300,000 years later, you're still doing it. Funny how that works. So here's my question for you. If you had to make clothing from scratch, no stores, no tools, just an animal and whatever your environment provides, where would you even start? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how bad your plan is.